Okay, thank you. Hi, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to this press conference that we know it has been switched back and forth for 2 times. The very first one, just to explain you a little bit, the very first time we had to reschedule because the colleagues from the U.S. Peace Council stayed longer than expected in Venezuela. And then the second time there was a misunderstanding with Malu, and the date was actually always on the 26th, today. Now, unfortunately, my Ambassador Moncada, is unable to join us today. He had some unforeseen meetings here at the UN, so perhaps he might join us sometime later this morning. But in any case, we just wanted to introduce our friends from the U.S. Peace Council. They have been with us here before a couple of weeks ago. They announced at that time a trip they were doing to Venezuela. So today we're having them back here at the UN so they can briefly report on the findings of their mission. So without any further ado, I just want to give the floor to them and to Vaman to perhaps introduce the team. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brother Joaquin. Greetings. I'm Bahman Azad, the Organizational Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council, which organized this delegation to Venezuela. We are just coming back, of course, after cancellations and delays. We finally managed to be all back. We had a very important and significant experience there. It was a big learning process. We had 13-member delegation in Venezuela, but unfortunately many of them, upon their return, they had to go to their own cities and all that. We are only 4 of us who are on the East Coast now. It included leadership of Veterans for Peace, Popular Resistance, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, United National Anti-War Coalition, International Action Center, and many others. It was quite an adventure because our arrival was exactly on the day that the attack on the electricity started. So we arrived in dark. And it was quite a chore, but it allowed us to see what people of Venezuela are experiencing as a result of all these U.S. pressures. My colleagues here are Margaret Flowers from Popular Resistance, Kevin Zees from Popular Resistance, and Sarah Flounders from International Action Center. Each one of them will explain, but I'll give you a brief summary of what we did. We had meetings with many important figures and authorities, with the foreign minister of Venezuela, with the top economists talking about sanctions and the impact internally. We talked with the health ministry or health services authorities who explained to us what the sanctions are doing to the health system. We met with the communities. We saw the people's dedication in support of their government. And we also had a meeting which was very important to all of us with the president of Electoral Council, who explained to us what has been going on about the elections and why all these claims about the new president are false. Finally, we were, our request was accepted by President Maduro to meet with him, and we met with him last Saturday, and it was quite an experience, and I'm sure my friends will explain to you. I will ask Margaret to first start. They will explain different aspects of our experience for you.
Thank you, Bauman, for that introduction. So I'm a pediatrician by training, so my interest in going to Venezuela in part was to look at what Venezuela is doing for the health of its people, since in the Venezuelan Constitution it actually guarantees human rights, something that we don't do here in the United States. And so much of what we hear in the United States is not accurate about Venezuela. So as many of you know, the United States and its allies have been sanctioning Venezuela for quite some time. In 2014, Congress passed a law. It was, as we know, our laws in Congress are typically named things that don't actually represent what the law is. So the name of this particular law was the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act, but actually laid the framework for the United States to sanction Venezuela. And then in 2015, of course, you know that President Obama declared that Venezuela was a national security threat, thereby opening the door for military intervention. And Venezuela is it's a wealthy country. They have the #1 in the world for oil reserves, for gold, very high up for gas, for diamonds and other minerals. And they're not able to use this wealth to support their system because of the sanctions. Under the Bolivarian process, they put a huge emphasis on the needs of those who are of lower income. And so since the Bolivarian process has begun, they built 6,000 clinics in the barrios. They trained 18,000 physicians, many of them who staff these clinics and live in the communities with people. They built universities. They started they built more than 2 million housing units to put people into homes. Some of them were completely outfitted with appliances for the people. They have done a lot with their food program because they have, over the years, they've imported so much of their food because they had the wealth to do that. And now they're having to, because they're not able to import as much, they're finding ways to produce more food. And so we visited some of the barrios as well as urban farms and talked with people. And it's 100% organic. They don't allow GMOs or pesticides to be used. And so a lot that Venezuela has done to lift up the health of its people. But since the sanctions have become more severe, they used to actually have a very high per capita, pharmaceuticals available. They were one of the highest in Latin America. But they've seen a severe reduction of that under the sanctions. And so now there's, the figure that I was given was 86% shortage of pharmaceuticals. And you see this on the television at night, on the news programs, in between the news stories. They have, somewhat kind of public ads that have the name of a person, the medicine that they need, and their phone number in case somebody has something that they can share with them. It's amazing the way that they try to make do in this situation. And in reality, Venezuela could be meeting the health needs of its population, but every time they turn, the U.S. obstructs them. So, we've had the sanctions where banks won't do financial transactions, so Venezuela tried a petrodollar, a type of a cryptocurrency, and the United States threatened sanctions against the company that processes the cryptocurrency. They then tried, using their gold, and the United States blocked the UK bank from releasing the gold to them. The health minister told us about reaching out to countries like India and Turkey to purchase medications from them, and the U.S. threatened those countries if they did that. So fortunately, Russia is helping the Venezuelans to get medications. Maduro announced this past week that they're increasing their pharmaceutical production. Of course, a lot of that relies on being able to get precursors to bring into the country to make those pharmaceuticals. So hopefully they'll be able to find ways to do that. But I guess the point that I wanted to make is that Venezuela has the resources to provide good health care and also the social determinants of health that people need. But because of these U.S. sanctions and the allies' cooperation with them, it's really having a severe impact on people's ability to get the medications that they need. And so these sanctions, I believe, would be considered to be illegal under the Rome Statute, and they need to be ended. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
My name's Kevin Zeese. I co-direct Popular Resistance. I'm trained as a lawyer, and so I'm going to focus my comments on the rule of law and democracy in Venezuela. I've also been a democracy advocate in the United States, and I was in Venezuela not just for this delegation, but also last year for the presidential election. Let me start by where the rule of law begins in a democracy, and that's with elections. There's no question that President Maduro was legitimately elected last year. There were 6 candidates running in the presidential race, almost a 50% turnout, and he received 68% of the vote. That's 9 million votes. That's more votes than President Trump or President Obama received of the potentially legal voters in Venezuela. Venezuela has a total population of 30 million, including non-voters, so 9 million voters is a very clear victory in an electoral system. And that electoral system is very well run. As I said, I've worked on democracy issues in the United States, and I went to see how the voting occurred there. In fact, there were 150 international election observers. Those election observers were unanimous in saying this was a legitimate election. There's no question about it being a legitimate election. People who say it's not I'm amazed they can do it with a straight face because the evidence is so clear. Now, there was a boycott of that election. The United States, through its embassy in Venezuela, put pressure on the opposition not to participate in the election. They didn't want any candidates running. They wanted to be able to say that this was an illegitimate election. And they did that because they knew they could not win. They knew they could not defeat Maduro's re-election. And so they thought, boycott and then claim it's illegitimate. In fact, I'd say the Venezuela election system is something the United States could learn a great deal from. They do one thing I'll just mention. There's a lot of reasons why. They first off start with a right to vote in the Constitution, which we don't have, which leads to more voting machines as populations need it. They actually make registration easy, make voting easy when the United States put roadblocks up. But the one thing they do that no other country in the world does is on election night, after the voting is finished, they do what's called a citizen's audit. They have both a paper record that's been verified by each voter that's put in the ballot box, and they have an electronic record. And for 52% of the machines at every precinct, randomly selected, they take the ballots, they read it, and they show it to everybody in the room. It's a public audit. It's videotaped. It's shown by the opposition. They read the vote, and they count it. And then they compare that count to the electronic vote count. If they're accurate, they count the election votes electronically. If not, they will count all the votes in that precinct. So it's a pretty amazing system, and one that, as I said, if the United States could learn from greatly. In fact, if we had registration ease the way they do, if we had voting ease the way they do, if we had reliable elections the way they do, I think we'd have very different government in the United States than we have today. That compares with the farce of the Guaido appointment. That was outside of the law. If you look at the Venezuela Constitution, it's very clear on when the President of the National Assembly can take the place of the President, of the elected President. And that is only when the President is unable to serve as President. He dies in office, resigns, the Supreme Court removes him. Only then can the National Assembly's President become President. And that's only actually before the President is inaugurated. After inauguration, it would go to the Vice President. So there's a clear violation of Section 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution. So we have the contrast, a legitimately elected president under the rule of law or a farce president violating the rule of law. That's the two choices. And every country that the U.S. has pressured to accept Guaido as the president is participating in a farce, and they know it's a farce. They know what's happening is illegal. And any media that reports it, and I know the State Department has chided U.S. media for using the term self-appointed and opposition leader, but that's what he is. He is self-appointed opposition leader. He's not the president. He's not the interim president. That is a false reporting, and that's false around the world. Another key area of illegality, and Margaret mentioned this, is the illegality of the economic sanctions. These sanctions are coercive measures. They're designed to coerce Venezuela to change their government and to get under the rule of the United States. A coercive measure like this violates the UN Charter. It's time for the international community to come together to say no to these U.S. sanctions that affect many nations. Iran, African nations, Asian nations, even Russia and China are threatened by sanctions. There are dozens of sanctioned countries and countries impacted by sanctions. It's time for these countries to come together and say no to the United States. It's time to challenge these sanctions in international courts and time to say that these countries are independent, sovereign nations that should not be punished with coercive measures in violation of international law. Finally, I want to focus on a developing story which has not gotten much attention in the United States but needs attention. It really shows the ugliness of U.S. foreign policy. Last week, the chief of staff of Guaido was arrested, Roberto Moreira. You could call him the terror chief. The evidence has now come out that he's been arrested. He was involved in organizing terror cells throughout Venezuela, bringing in people trained in Colombia, mercenaries trained in Colombia from Central American countries to come in and to cause terror in Venezuela. This is being funded by money seized, illegally seized, by the sanctions against Venezuela. These coercive measures are now being used to fund terrorism in Venezuela, funded by Venezuelan assets against Venezuela. And what they had planned was to be dressed up as Venezuela. This is all now shown from cell phones and other materials seized from Morero's arrest. What they planned was these mercenaries be dressed up as Venezuelan military and to attack the electrical system, attack the metro cable, which brings people from the downtown to the mountains and as a means of transportation, and to attack the presidential palace, which is the seat of government, and to commit assassinations against President Maduro and other selected leaders. This was all planned, is now all being shown. This is the height of illegality. And then why is the United States doing this? Because they have failed with this farce Guaido. They failed with economic sanctions. They failed with the attack on the electoral grid, and they cannot get other countries to agree to a military attack. Even allies of the United States are saying that's too much. So how is the United States going to get a military attack? They're going to create violence and havoc inside Venezuela. And then they're going to say we have to go in and protect people because of this military conflict going on in Venezuela. Well, it's been exposed. It's a fraud. And it's something that the international community needs to condemn the United States for. The United States was trying to conduct terrorism in Venezuela with this farce President Guaido and his terror cell allies, and that is something we all have to stand against. Let me just say, finally, we are speaking really on the behalf of the majority of the American people, on behalf of the majority of the Venezuelan people. No one wants war. People want a dialogue to resolve the issues in Venezuela. This is not something that should be resolved by militarism. It should be resolved by diplomacy. And people know that militarism would be a terrible mistake. Foreign Minister Lavrov talked to our Secretary of State recently and made it clear that Russia will not stand for military intervention. They showed that position by flying in troops to Venezuela this week. Russia has made it clear. China is a partner with Venezuela in gold and oil, has invested billions of dollars in Venezuela. And so an attack on Venezuela is not just an attack on Venezuela, which is bad enough. It's an attack on Venezuela's partners, which include China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, many other countries, Cuba, many other countries in the world are siding with Venezuela. This becomes a geopolitical mess, and it will be a defeat for the United States. Venezuela is twice as large as Iraq. It has a military of 200,000 and has civilian militia of more than 2 million. There's no way the United States is going to succeed in Venezuela. They'll do a lot of destruction, a lot of chaos, not just for Venezuela, but for the region. And so militarism would be a terrible mistake. This U.S. coup has failed. It's time for the United States to obey the rule of law, step back, and recognize the sovereignty and independence of Venezuela. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Flounders from the International Action Center and the No War on Venezuela campaign. I want to address the people's support for the elected government of Venezuela and the totally false, phony crisis of fake news in the U.S. A shameful form of absolutely no real reporting at all. Just taking and running with one line only. The government of President Maduro was, we just heard, overwhelmingly elected by the whole people of Venezuela. Along with, there were thousands of election observers at every stage of the process. And it's an electoral process in which millions participated. And they are determined to defend their vote by millions and millions of people in the streets. We participated while there in huge demonstrations that have been throughout the whole Bolivarian revolution, throughout the whole process, but actually stepped up and widening even now. Every Saturday since the U.S. attempted coup, these massive outpourings of supporters, and the supporters of Guaido are insignificant at this time and demoralized, losing heart, disoriented. The huge rally we participated in, people came through through unions, from community organizations, militia units. It was really quite an incredible And that was just in Caracas. This is taking place across the country. We went to a huge rally taking place right in front of the presidential palace. It is every single day, different unions, schools, young people, groups taking part in the defense of the elected presidency. That's how strong the support for President Maduro is. The vote is also defended by the Venezuelan armed forces that have not broken, as the U.S. fully expected and announced. It didn't happen. And the vote is defended by a popular militia of over 2 million, organized from the community councils on up. And this is an incredible accomplishment. There's not a government in the world, if they didn't have popular support, that could withstand the weight of the popular militias, such as we see in Venezuela today. And the U.S. should take note of this also in their plans and schemes. The very idea that the U.S. government can simply step in and support an unknown, insignificant individual, unelected, from an ultra-right party with a history of political violence, is such an insult to Venezuela, an insult throughout Latin America, and an insult on the world stage. It's an insult to peoples who have suffered more than 200 years now of U.S. coups, invasions, appointed governments. And the NATO, which is a U.S.-commanded military alliance, the support of the NATO countries in this is just a rubber stamp on a completely criminal process. We should remember that while the U.S. Government says that they can decide and appoint a government, that in the United States today we have about the lowest rate of participation in elections almost anywhere in the world, while Venezuela has 97% registration rate. In the U.S., there are states where 30 and 50% of the potential electorate are not even registered. And we have a president who didn't even win the popular vote. So the very arrogance of saying what government is legal and or illegal and therefore should just step down, collapse itself. We also want to denounce, and we learned a great deal about the U.S. government seizure of billions of dollars of Venezuelan assets, both in actual banks, a Venezuelan-owned bank, a Venezuelan-Russian-owned bank, the illegal seizure of Citgo, more than 5,000 gas stations in the U.S. that Citgo owns. Citgo is a Venezuelan-owned gas corporation, 5,000 gas stations, 4 terminals, 3 refineries, billions of dollars assets, and that this Venezuelan-owned asset could just be seized and turned over to an appointed president. This is really modern-day piracy. I want to especially address the sanctions, which are a war crime against the entire civilian population, explicitly prohibited in the Geneva and Nuremberg Conventions and the UN Charter, that even in times of war, to attack or withhold vital, essential medicines or foods or supplies is prohibited, as is prohibited to interfere in the communications or electrification of a country. So the attack on the electric grid in Venezuela, these are war crimes. Now, the people of Venezuela and the government of Venezuela has made it clear that they are not helpless. They have the most extensive food distribution program, more than 6 million what are called clap boxes. That's the name of the agency that distributes these to community councils throughout the country. 6 million families, that's 2/3 of the population. And this basic box of supplies that has corn and beans and rice and coffee and salt and sugar and shampoo and personal hygiene products and cooking oil and a whole number of goods is a basic insurance against the starvation and the hyperinflation that has been imposed on Venezuela through the sanctions and through the financial seizure of both of assets and the distortions imposed in the economy. So both the clap boxes, the free meals in schools, the feeding centers where people can go for cooked meals, this is quite an incredible government program and distributed at the local levels with huge support. The other thing that was for us so interesting is the micro gardens, an actual ministry of urban agriculture that through vacant lots, backyards, rooftops, small greenhouses, every community in Venezuela today is learning to grow their own food. And this has provided already more than 25% of the fruit, vegetable, and basic protein needs of the population. And it's an expanding program. They expect it soon to be 50%. And this includes from the community gardens and fruit and raising chicken and rabbits and goats for milk and involving the whole population in these gardens. The way in which they're organized, it really showed a determination. You can't do an operation like this without huge mass support all the way down to the grassroots. So this is a government that has an entire people that has rejected national humiliation of an appointed government, a demand that the whole people bow down to a U.S. demand and accept and someone no one even knew before. I think the fake media, of course, it has some impact in the U.S. In Venezuela, that's not the media. But it's also no longer the media for millions of people globally, including here in the U.S. The corporate media can put out one story. There are many forms of alternative media where people turn for information. So, but the fake news story that the people of Venezuela are starving, that they needed the borders broken into, that they needed trucks to slam through, and that these trucks were actually distributing goods and needs, is just an absolute fraud. Now, we arrived and our flight was delayed coming in because of the attack on the entire electric grid. The way in which this was dealt with, we want to just compare it to the small island of Puerto Rico, hit in a hurricane, and it took efforts almost a year to restore electricity. But within 5-6 days, the electricity throughout the entire country was back on. There was another attack just yesterday, again shutting down the electricity, and able to do this, of course, because the equipment and the software and all of this is based in Houston. Like so many countries around the world, nothing is totally unsealed. And so the U.S. has an ability to reach across continents, to reach into software, and to shut down banking, to cut off supplies, to see 6,000 medical clinics, and yet every one of those doctors that are trained, if 80% of the essential medicines are gone, they face a huge attack. So there is a determination to survive, to accept material assistance from countries that offer it, where it comes in legitimately, to accept delegations of human solidarity, which was our delegation, to reject the breaking of the borders, the breaking of the electricity, a recognition that the days when U.S. government can appoint governments, dismiss governments, are long past. We are planning, everyone in this delegation, to be in Washington as the NATO generals meet and planning the next war. This Saturday we'll be there in a demonstration, forces from around the world. And as we were on the day when February 23rd, the U.S. attempted to smash into the borders of Venezuela. There were demonstrations in 153 cities around the world. So the people in Venezuela are a force, and solidarity around the world is also a powerful force.
Thank you, Sarah. A couple of points I wanted to emphasize. One, with regard to these micro gardens in Venezuela, people were not just looking at it as a source of food. They looked at it and they explained it. They talked to us as a way of defending the sovereignty of their country. That was how they approached it, which was very fascinating. Also, President Maduro also explained to us that actually the map and blueprints of the electrical system was in the hand of a company in Texas, and the attack, they have traced the source back to Chicago. That was his explanation for us. But thank you all. We are open for questions if any of you.
Thank you. My question is for all of you, and I have a couple questions. You have mentioned that the crisis is being brought upon Venezuela because of the sanctions imposed by the United States. One of the questions we have is the United Nations have to keep track of the people that have been leaving Venezuela since 2015. That is 2 years before the first sanction was imposed in Venezuela on individuals during the Obama administration in 2017. The actual sanctions presented by the Trump administration happened this year on PDVSA, Citgo, and the banks. How you explain the droves of people that have been leaving Venezuela and also the humanitarian crisis that was declared by the United Nations and the reports on that? And then the other part that you mentioned is the economy of Venezuela. We have not had any reports by the Central Bank of Venezuela for a couple of years, and also no reports on health status like chickenpox, normal diseases. So how you can see the possibility of those reports to come back? Because I believe the international community, especially us, the media, need those official data to be able to keep track on that. And that is something that we haven't seen for years in terms of what is the economy status, what is the inflation projections. The international community has projected 10 million inflation by this year. So can you kind of give us a little sense of what is your take on that, especially after what you have mentioned?
I could start. Yeah, to answer some of those questions. So people migrate. I mean, that happens in every country. There are migrations across borders. I don't have the actual figures. I know that there are what I've heard is 6 million Colombians who've migrated out of Colombia because of the violence there and are living in Venezuela, and many of them have been given free housing and welcomed there. So I don't know the net numbers, but we see these types of migrations all the time. In terms of the economy, the inflation was explained to us is in part because the U.S., I think it's through its credit rating systems, can artificially, set what the value of the bolivar is compared to the dollar, and that has been a factor in driving inflation. It's been a factor that has had a significant impact on the GDP of Venezuela. Economic warfare, the many facets of it, they estimated, caused a loss of production, a significant loss of production. Since they began, they said $90 billion worth of lost production. And then you add that to the tens of billions that the United States is not allowing them to have. So these are all, when we say that there's a crisis, I mean, yes, they're doing their best to make sure that people are fed. The children that I saw, walking around, going into the communities, the babies looked nice and chubby. The children looked happy and playful. I didn't see anything like we would see in Yemen. But it's not a crisis to the extent that we should be imposing on them in any way and forcing in this humanitarian aid that is not even aid. It comes with an agenda. It comes with a political agenda. The Red Cross of Colombia said this is not aid because it has a political agenda. What we need to recognize is that this is a direct impact of the economic warfare that's being waged upon the people of Venezuela and preventing them from being able to do the basic things that they need to do. In terms of the health outcomes, we did meet with the health. He was a previous health minister and now is in charge of procurement of medications. I do have some data and copies of slides. He gave us a PowerPoint presentation looking at the drop in the number of medications that they have available in the country. The government has told us that they do have reports. I haven't seen them yet, but hopefully I'll be able to get a chance to look at those soon on the health impacts. But there was this kind of fake news that went out during the electrical crisis, saying that there were all of these deaths in the hospitals. And when we looked at actually, and in the media they reported that the hospital reports actually said there were no deaths. So what we're hearing up here is a very different picture than what's actually happening down there.
I'll just respond as well. The first sanctions actually were 2004 by President Bush. President Obama escalated those sanctions, and President Trump has escalated them further. So it's been a long-term economic war that's been going on. And those first sanctions came after the U.S.-supported coup against Hugo Chavez, which lasted 48 hours before the people returned to power. So this has been a long-time economic war. There are many factors, though. It's not just the economic sanctions. The tremendous drop in the value of oil, the per barrel from over $150 to below $50 a barrel, had a gigantic impact on the Venezuelan economy. That happened almost at the time that Maduro came into office. That was then followed by escalation of sanctions by President Obama. But Venezuela's economy is based on oil. 90% of its foreign currency comes in because of their oil industry. This has been true since the 1920s. Presidents Chavez and Maduro have tried to change that, tried to diversify, but there's an economic analysis known as the Dutch disease that shows how difficult it is for any country with a very strong natural resource that brings in lots of foreign currency for them to change their economy. So that drop in oil prices, some say was even manipulated by Saudi Arabia and the United States. But whether it was manipulated or not, that was a major factor. Then on top of that came the efforts by oligarchs in Venezuela to hide goods, to hoard goods. In fact, food subsidized by the Venezuelan government was discovered being sold in Colombia. Warehouses were discovered with food and essentials, and people have been prosecuted for hoarding and hiding those essentials. And that has also caused a speculation problem. Margaret mentioned how the ratings agencies in the United States have impacted the inflation rate by giving ratings to the Venezuelan currency that caused a opportunity for speculation. Again, those with money, those who are already trying to undermine the government, use that opportunity to create and add to the inflation problem. So there are many factors. It's pretty amazing, in fact, to me, that the Venezuelan government's able to keep people fed, keep people as relatively healthy with access to doctors, providing housing and food, to do all that while under attack by the United States and its allies. That's a pretty challenging feat, and I have no doubt if the Venezuelan government was left alone and not under an economic war that's goal is to create economic chaos, if that was not happening, I think the Venezuelan people would be much better off, and it's really time for these economic sanctions to be challenged in the International Court of Justice and shown to be illegal under the UN Charter and various international laws.
I want to leave time for other journalists here to ask questions. I'll just say short that it is the rankest form of hypocrisy for the U.S. to express concern about people leaving Venezuela at a time when U.S. wars have created millions of refugees, displaced people in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, throughout the entire Middle East, Afghanistan. the wars, U.S. wars, are the greatest cause of refugee and displaced people. We should also, the appointment of Abrams, who's directly responsible for the looting, the chaos, the dismemberment of whole countries in Central America, the death squads and the mercenaries. That's Abrams' policy. He is now specializing in Venezuela. That's his program. That's what he wants, a program that will create millions of refugees. Being at the border in Tijuana, where you see people desperately, what are they fleeing? Complete hunger, gangs, drugs that have happened in their countries based on the U.S. coup in Honduras. That's the biggest source of refugees coming right to the U.S. border now. So we should never think that any of this is based on concern for refugees. There are people leaving Venezuela. They're not happy with the government. That's true. They benefited in the past very well. But for the overwhelming population, this is a government that has made dramatic changes within the last 20 years. And in the last 5 years, to build 2.5 million low-income housing units, huge jobs program, but housing on that scale, you know, they're like 1 million low-income housing units in the U.S. with 10 times the population, and homelessness here a real problem. So I think that it's a completely phony issue, those who've left Venezuela, compared to any of the other countries where this is a gigantic social problem.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for this briefing. This is really, really needed here because the degree of brainwashing to which we are subjected it's unspeakable. I have some very serious concerns. I have been studying, there was a marvelous book written by an American lawyer about the U.S. determination to overthrow Salvador Allende in Chile. Simplified, described every single angle, every detail that the U.S. used to destroy that economy. The term they used was make the economy scream. But every single detail, I think one of the statistics was during Allende's presidency, over 90% of non-military aid to Chile was cut, and over 90% of military aid to Chile was supplied. The question I have, because I've reread that book many times. I worked in Chile during the Pinochet period. It seems as though there is an exact repeat in Venezuela of what was done in Chile. And in the end, in 1973, when a popular referendum was held and the people supported Allende, the decision was made in Washington, military intervention. And of course, we had already assassinated Schneider, and Prats was driven out of the country. This is very, very terrifying and overwhelming, and I can only think of what Daniel Ellsberg said about the U.S. attack on Vietnam. We are not just on the wrong side, we are the wrong side. So the question is, with this overwhelming determination, and it was Al Gore who used the term psychotic fear of socialism. He then retracted it, but he did use it, and the New Yorker published it. What can be done to stop this process? Because as a United States citizen, and as a patriotic citizen, I do not want to have my country involved in criminal actions throughout the world.
Yeah, it's incredibly shameful for me, being a citizen of the United States, to see this blatant violation of law that the United States is perpetrating against Venezuela. And what is very impressive about Venezuela is the deep political education. You really hear it everywhere. You know, if you go into the communities and you ask people about what's going on, they explain it in the lens of U.S. imperialism. If on the television, you know, when people are speaking, they talk about U.S. imperialism. So people understand what's going on there and the level of organization they have in the communities through the communal councils and the communes and the different, just social organizations is really incredible. It gives them an ability to organize when these types of attacks happen, like the attack on the electrical grid, and prevent people from responding in a non-productive way. We did hear of some instances of looting in Zulia, which is on the border, and people believe that was because there were paramilitaries that were coming in and trying to, create, like agent provocateur, right? So these things are happening, and this is part of the reason why Venezuela is so resilient against these measures. The U.S. keeps failing, and Venezuela keeps exposing them, over and over again. And so it's really actually solidifying more support for the Maduro government, because even those who recognize that the Maduro government is not perfect and have criticized it understand that they need to unify right now against these attacks. So it's positive to see that happening. But the foreign minister, Jorge Ariaza, met with Elliot Abrams, I think, twice. And one of the times that he met with him, Abrams said to him, this is going to be a long, protracted, basically implied that the U.S. is not giving up. And so it is very concerning that the fact that there is currently not much international support for a direct military invasion, that they're going to be using methods inside of the country to try to create chaos. I think as people from the United States, we have to be very clear about educating others about what the reality is about Venezuela. That's why we went, and we encourage many more people to go down there and see for themselves and learn for themselves. I think we have to clearly call for an end to the economic war against Venezuela. Upon my return, I wrote a report. I met with my member of Congress last week. I delivered it to him, with what I did and what my recommendations are. And we have to clearly, be loud and in the streets saying no war, no military invasion on Venezuela. And I just think that groundswell is growing, and we have the potential to make it even louder.
Hello, Lenka White from the Mainichi newspaper. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, what are your plans now? Are you going to reach some local U.S. newspaper, or maybe try to speak up internationally? Do you have any schedule or program? Thank you so much.
Well, as Sarah mentioned, that this Friday there'll be a large protest in front of the Saturday there'll be a large protest in front of the White House. And that will be the beginning of a week of actions that will go on throughout the week up to the 4th, where the NATO foreign ministers are going to meet at the State Department, and there'll be people protesting there as well. That's just the short term. But our longer term is we are in solidarity with Venezuela, and we will work with people in Venezuela and people around the world to build that solidarity. Because as regard to the previous question, we believe it's going to take both people in the United States, people around the world, and people in Venezuela to respond to the United States, because the United States is a bully, and it's a big bully, and we need to have the whole schoolyard tell the bully that they're behaving improperly, and so that's where our intent is, to create that kind of international solidarity.
May I add a couple of things? First, regarding the question in the back, we have arranged to receive printed and documented documents from various institutions and ministries of Venezuela, and they have promised to send us all those data about health situation, financial situation, the banking, and all the other frozen assets and the impacts, everything. That's one. Secondly, we have also worked closely with our host Committee for International Solidarity, COSI, in Venezuela, that hosted us in those extremely difficult times to maintain our schedules and get us everywhere in the dark and everything. They are working with us closely now. We are in constant contact with them to provide us with updates and information about about every aspects that we need to bring to the American people to show the reality of what is going on in Venezuela, as opposed to all the fake news that people are being fed and misled into. That's what we are doing. Sir, did you want to mention something?
Yeah, I think the days are long past when it was 45 years ago in Chile, or we could look at Iran or Congo, or the ability, Vietnam, and looking forward now into Syria, the ability of the U.S. to simply tear down a government and go in and set up an occupation are past. This is really, there is a new reality coming from people's minds, their consciousness. Everywhere in Venezuela, people were acutely aware of the U.S. script. They were reading ahead. They were looking at, they would tell you exactly what was done in Chile, to the economy, to the shortages. They were more up to date on any of that information than we were as political activists. And so they had plans. And that is, for example, a ministry of urban agriculture. People are determined to feed themselves, to stock up supplies, to have batteries, to have water and rain barrels and all kinds of things so that they could survive this. And there are countries around the world that are no longer willing for the U.S. just to country by country decide and set up governments. So I think there is, we really need to be aware of that new reality, and we are also part of that new reality too, that there are alternative sources of information and of action. There are people determined to act in their own interests and the interests of people here where housing and hunger is growing. There are, by U.S. own figures, more than 20 million people in the U.S. right now who go to bed hungry every night. Now, there's 32 million people in Venezuela. Let's talk about hunger. Hunger right here. Homelessness right here. And that is the reality that we're addressing in coming back. We've already given reports that meetings which, when they're on Facebook and all kinds of other forms of media, reach thousands of people. And we think that the demonstration Saturday also, it will be streamed across the world. So those kinds of confrontations are very, very important. And it's the new reality. So those days of empire are waning.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for coming and listening to us. I think one of the key elements that we all have recognized is the role of the media in this country and how they are distorting the whole reality of Venezuela in the eyes of the U.S. people. And as you asked what we are planning to do, we are really planning to counter that in every way we can in the United States, because the people of U.S. can play a key role and the most important role in stopping this crime that's being committed against Venezuela. Finally, I would like to thank once again, through this platform, the Committee for International Solidarity in Venezuela that really made everything possible for us, and they went through hell to make it a success. Thank you very much for coming.
And we should also thank the Peace Council who organized this delegation to Venezuela and very much connected with COSI, the solidarity organization there.